Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We are excited to learn from Newtrient and Michael Best's strategies on how dairy farmers could benefit from new water quality legislation. Special thanks to Newtrient for sponsoring this webinar. My name is Joanna Guza, the Digital Communications Manager at the Dairy Business Association. I will be running the logistics of the webinar and moderating questions at the end. This webinar will be recorded, so please contact me to access the recording. Now it is time to meet our presenters. I will kick it off to Jamie to start us off.
All right, thank you so much, and thanks for having us on the call today, and thanks for those who have joined as well. My name is Jamie Vandermolen. I am the Director of Communications for Newtrient and have been working for dairy farmers for several years, both at Newtrient and prior to this for the National Dairy Checkoff Organization. I'm going to introduce the two speakers today. The first is Stephen Rowe, who is the CEO of Newtrient, and he is committed to reducing the environmental footprint of dairy and making it economically viable to do so. Prior to Newtrient, he served as the General Counsel for Northwest Dairy Association and has really built a career around the topic that we'll be talking about today. His legal practice spans 30 years, and nearly half of which was in environmental and corporate practice. The second speaker we have is Karen Timberlake. She's senior member of Michael Best Strategies out of Madison, Wisconsin. And she is part of their government affairs team and has excellent relationships in legislative and executive branches of the state government. So she's been, both her and Michael Best have been a great partner in this work, and we're excited to be here today to talk about it. Now I will turn it over to Stephen Rowe.
Good. Hi, everybody. Steve Rowe here. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to do this and to continue the dialogue with DBA. And I just have to take a moment and say what an excellent group DBA has been to work with, and we've been really kind of digging into this for a few years now, and I just want to thank the leadership of this organization that has been a tremendous source of information and a great voice for the industry, very helpful for us in developing what I think will be a very exciting next step in Wisconsin and may change the landscape and create some hope in a way that's quite unique and not completely tied to the milk price. All right, Jamie, go ahead and start the next slide. So as Jamie said, I'm the CEO of Newtrient. I think most of you know what Newtrient is. I'll explain a little bit more, but the punchline for this organization is that our mission is to reduce the environmental footprint of dairy and to make it economically viable to do so. And you know that those two things have to go hand in hand. What most folks outside of the commodity agricultural world don't understand is the way commodity pricing works. And I have found in speaking to folks who are outside of the family, outside of the dairy family, I'm often told, well, if you can do these things, why don't you just do it? And it leads into a conversation around pricing and how milk prices have far more to do with what our relationship is or whether China is thirsty or not, rather than we have no control here locally for the most part. So let me go on and tell you a little bit of the roots of Newtrient and how it got started. Several years ago, we were looking at how to generate income from taking environmental advances. At that point, the conversation started around digesters. But it was in those days that some of you can remember where the electrical contracts for digester-generated energy was enough to finance the digester and then some. Those days have really gone away. There's still some opportunity in the natural gas space, but there's actually more uncertainty now than there used to be. So we also recognized that there's been this increased regulatory pressure on farms. So Jamie mentioned that I was general counsel at Northwest Dairy Associations, which some of you may know as Dairy Gold. And in our backyard, and a group of members were sued by a citizen group because of nitrates coming off the farm and getting into drinking water. Some of you may know that as the Cow Palace case, and that was a big change, a real sort of eye-opening event where we had a federal court saying, hey, if you over-apply manure, you are subject to citizen suits, and that excess manure is considered a waste under solid and hazardous waste regulations. So, boy, that was a real wake up, because the industry really felt that there was a valid exemption to manure, and this was a case, the first of what I think will end up being several, saying that's not the case. But the real issue was, again, the farmers you're all limited in what you can afford to do to internalize those environmental advancement costs. We don't make enough money off the milk. Heck, we barely make enough money off the milk to make the milk. So when you add on the environmental burdens, you get the results of what we're seeing in Wisconsin and in many places around the country, where a lot of folks are saying, I can't continue. And it's a very bad situation. And as you all know, I don't need to delve more into that. So with increased regulatory pressure, our view was we needed to create positive incentives. The idea of just regulating the dairy industry more was not a viable option and was not going to work. It was just going to drive more people out of business. We also found that there are lots of technologies and practices that do benefit the environment, but again, it's the economic hurdle. So how do we improve the economics of environmental technologies and practices in a way that really should enhance the income of the farm is the ultimate goal. And all of this leads to trust in dairy, both as farmers and as a large and important product set of product lines. We really have seen in working in this space over the last few years that agriculture, and primarily dairy, that's who we work for, we really can be part of the solution. And we also believe that if we aren't seen as part of the solution, we will be seen as part of the problem, and these challenges will only increase. So that's the big picture of where we are today and what we're working diligently to work toward. So the board of Newtrient, we're a unique organization. We are not a trade association. We are not a promotion group. We are made up, our board is made up of who you see on the screen, 12 co-ops, and then DMI has made an investment in us, and they have a seat on the board, as well as National Milk, and we coordinate with National Milk. Though they don't pay in, we use them for some of our lobbying efforts in DC. So we're privately owned. We can move at the pace of business. We don't have to, say, report what we do through USDA the way the checkoff has to do. So we have a lot more flexibility, and we can be what I like to call mercenary-like in achieving our goal. And it's allowed us to move much faster and more efficiently. We also don't have to move at the pace of the slowest member. Everyone comes along or they opt out of certain projects that we're working on or investments. So the first thing we did was we looked at all of the technologies that are available to be used on farms, really for nutrient or manure management. And I can tell you, it was heartbreaking years ago. I had several people over the years come to me and say, hey, I've got a phosphorus loading problem, but I'm very excited because I'm putting in a digester. Some of you may have groaned at hearing that, but the reason some of you are groaning, as you know, is the digesters don't really do anything for phosphorus or nitrate loading. And so we saw that there was a lack of understanding of what's out there and what's available. So Newtrient set out a few years ago to develop what has become our Newtrient catalog, and that's on our website. If you've not gone and looked at it, I encourage you to do so. And we have assessed, in the way Consumer Reports might assess appliances, about 300 different manure management technologies. And we assembled a very interesting, capable team of experts ranging across the country from Cornell, Michigan State, Washington State, UC Davis. And these are the folks that I call the lab coat folks. And then we had a handful that I call the dirty boots guys, who are the ones who really understand, yeah, it may work in a lab, but it's never going to work on a farm. And we brought these folks together. They looked at all of these technologies. They have reviewed them. They give their opinion on them. There's parts of the website that talk about what the technology is, and that's done in partnership with the vendor. And then there's a section on each technology that is written only by Newtrient and its technical team, and we score all these technologies. I hope you find it useful. It's a very interesting way to do this. And we did it in a very public, open source way. What I mean by that is anybody can go in and look at this. And there was talk in the beginning of, should we only do it by subscription? Should we only do it for dairy farmers? Our philosophy was a little unique in that we said, no, I want the regulators and policymakers and investors and other technology developers to see what can be done, to see what is out there, and to see why these technologies aren't being installed at a great adoption rate. And generally that's the economics involved, or very often the technology developer doesn't understand dairy farming. I've had many people come to me and say, hey, I've got your solution. I can go from manure to clean water. And the question we often ask these folks, always ask them, is, okay, that's great. What happens to all the little piles of stuff you've made along the way? And is that useful? Does that allow me to use those nutrients on my farm? Can I use the fiber for products or for bedding? And so we often work with these companies to get them to better understand what dairy farming really is. So we ran into a problem. We looked at all these technologies. That information is all out and available to you. But this chart that I'm showing is really oversimplified investment. On the left, what's the investment for a particular manure management technology? And it breaks down into two big categories, as you know, installation costs and operating costs. So we know that if, for example, I can remove the water from your nutrients so that you don't have to worry about your lagoons filling, or you can store the nutrients to when they're most useful for your fields, or you can have them dry enough to transport them further. All of those things do help the farm. There's economic benefit to the farm, but it's typically not enough to justify the investment in the original technology. So it's understandable that these aren't being adopted in significant volumes. So what's left in that investment piece is what we in Newtrient call the benefits gap, and that's what's missing. And we have been working at reducing that benefits gap so the investment in some of these technologies can get you back to even or better. And one of the tools that we've been working hard at in several states is what this webinar is about, these market-based solutions or ecosystem services markets. We have on our website a very simple video that we'll make sure that DBA leadership has. We've also done a webinar on this more generally, that's available. I'm not going to run the video today because it's a little complicated to do it on the webinar, but it'll help you understand or explain to others in your operation or in the family what ecosystem services are. But our belief in what they are, the concept is, we believe that the lowest cost voluntary environmental benefit or action should be incented or caused economically by those who have the highest cost pollution prevention obligations. And so what I mean by that, and what you'll see is, as you know, there are people in the community that have permits to achieve certain pollution prevention standards or limits. We know that you, on many of the farms, can achieve those limits at a lower cost than, say, the downstream paper mill or the wastewater treatment plant. So the whole theory we're trying to grow is that permit holder, let's just call it the paper mill for today, or the municipal wastewater treatment plant, they should be able to buy those pollution prevention services from you, because the technologies you use to manage your manure and the way you manage your ground can achieve their goals at a lower cost, very often about 10% of the cost. You can achieve it at a lower cost than they can. So when you look at it from a whole society or a whole community or the whole state, this makes perfect sense. The lowest cost pollution prevention should volunteer to go first and get paid for it by those who have those obligations and have to do it at a higher cost. They should pay you. So that's the idea of water quality ecosystem services. So let me sort of bust some myths here on this slide. So the idea of ecosystem services gets talked about in lots and lots of arenas. There's a list on the left. It's not exhaustive, but I'm going to pick one out. So biodiversity. Let's talk about butterflies and pollinators. Certainly a topic that a lot of folks have interest in, and biodiversity is a topic that has generated a lot of interest, particularly in the NGOs. But there's no one who is paying or obligated to pay for biodiversity services. And so when it comes to an ecosystem market, there's no demand other than the desire for the outcome. As compared to, in water quality, there's a downstream permit holder who is already paying a lot of money to reduce their phosphorus, and they would be interested in lowering the cost of that phosphorus removal. That is a market. The other stuff is goodwill and voluntary, and if someone will pay you to not mow your milkweed so you have more monarch butterflies, hey, that's great. But that's voluntary on both sides. The reason there's so much hope for an ecosystem services market for water quality is there's already a demand. There's already people trying to achieve what we as dairy farmers can achieve at a lower cost. So lots of different types of markets. There aren't that many that have a demand side requirement. That's why water quality is so intriguing here. And here it just shows a little bit of who the buyers can be. And then there's a set of non-regulated buyers. For example, the Nature Conservancy, which is now a huge or global organization, really started out just by buying wetlands that were in controversial areas. If they're interested in Wisconsin to reduce phosphorus loading, great, they can buy credits as well. But the real target are those who hold permits and are obligated to reduce phosphorus and are looking for a lower price to do that. So we as Newtrient looked at these markets all around the world, and there's a couple of fascinating studies that have been done. And there are a handful of countries that have really embraced these ecosystem service markets. Believe it or not, there are about 500 or 600 of these programs around the world. Already about $40 billion, and that's with a B, about $40 billion a year go through some sort of ecosystem services transaction every year around the world. In the U.S., we've been sort of stuck in a pattern of we make a rule, we limit some sort of effluent or emission, and then we enforce to force that party to achieve that limit. The opportunity that's in front of us now is to say, here's a limit, but who can do it at a lower cost? That's something that's really very new to the States. I'll tell you globally also, the watershed programs like we're talking about today really are the lion's share of these programs, and about $25 billion are transacted each year around the world. So let me give you an example where it's sort of the most robust. Believe it or not, China is using these tools quite effectively. You know, China pulled much of their country out of poverty into the beginnings of the middle class over the last 10 to 15 years. And it's very common, but what they did is what happens in many parts of the world. They did significant and severe environmental damage as they rebuilt their cities, built transportation systems, put in huge dams, electrical power systems. They did tremendous environmental damage. And as they learned actually to feed their population, some huge dairies, very big on pork. And then now what they're finding, in order to recover the benefits that come from this growth in their economy, they're saying to the folks in the rural communities, we used to value the trees on your land, for example, because we were building things. Now we value those trees to hold the hillsides in place and to shade the rivers for the fish. So we're going to pay you to not cut these trees. So that's just one example of the kind of ecosystem services market that a country like China has taken full advantage of. It does another thing here that I also think is a great advantage here in the U.S. if we can really get some good traction. It campaigns money from urban to rural communities, and it moves money from urban to rural communities, and it allows us in the rural community to show the urban community the broad set of advantages that we bring. We bring lifestyle advantages. We can filter the nutrients. We have the trees. We have the carbon to address climate change. It really shows that what we all do as dairy farmers goes way beyond just delivering great cheese and milk and other products. So it really is, this is kind of a personal thing to me. These concepts really reknit the relationship between the farmers and ultimately our customers. So that's sort of the social piece that I really like a lot. We looked in the U.S. in trying to build these markets at all of the attempts to do water quality markets. And this slide shows that there's about 30 or 40 of these attempts around the country. And we asked ourselves over the last few years, why have they not flourished? And what we found were a couple of common answers. One, as you can see, many of these have very small watersheds. They cover very small areas. And usually these programs were developed because someone got a grant, some not-for-profit developed the program, and then once the grant money ran out, the program didn't flourish or go anywhere. I mean, you don't see really any of these programs that cover an entire state or an entire portion of the country. So the watersheds are too small, and what that means is you don't have a great mix of urban and rural. You have rural opportunities, but very often you don't have permit holders in the rural community. That's why I'm very excited about doing this in Wisconsin, because you do have this great mix of industrial, municipal, and non-point sources or agriculture. It's a great mix. I'm really excited about what we'll be able to do here. The other piece that was a real impediment to these programs working was very often, usually the permit holder, say the wastewater treatment plant manager, in order to lower their cost for compliance, had to go find a farmer, or the farmer had to go find a wastewater treatment plant, and they had to strike some sort of contractual deal between the two of them. And what the regulators don't understand is these folks, we're from different planets from each other. Our motivations are different, our desires are different, our goals are different, and the way we operate is different. The wastewater treatment plant, what they want to do is they want to reduce their cost, and they want compliance certainty. They want to know for sure they're going to be in compliance with their permit. On the agricultural or farming side, what we want to know is if I'm going to go take out a big loan to buy some of this, for example, phosphorus reduction equipment, I need to know that I'm going to get a steady stream of income to pay off that loan in order to sell my phosphorus reductions to that paper mill or the wastewater treatment plant. So the whole motivations were different. So the next slide, I'm going to answer that question with what we're doing here in Wisconsin. But the components that make up a strong market are what I have here. And what were not captured in many of the programs around the country already. Clear demand. Who's the permit holder? Who's under the economic pressure to reduce? Who has legal obligations to reduce? Supply. Are there tools to create the phosphorus reduction or nitrate control? Are there good practices we can do on our lands? And what are the economic challenges that need to be overcome? For us, the product, the outcomes, are reduced phosphorus loading, and also what can be done with our solids. Right now, it's nightmarish to move wet manure around the countryside. But if some of these technologies, if I can remove 80% of the moisture, you can move those solids and phosphorus where it belongs, apply it when it needs to be applied, and you can move it much further. So, policy, until recently, I can tell you the messages coming from EPA were very mixed. We have a very unique and interesting opportunity that we'll explain a little bit more in a few minutes. But right now, I can tell you there is a wonderful window of opportunity both at EPA and at USDA to get these things done. This fifth item is what really this bill that's in the Wisconsin State House is really about, is a transaction path. Where in the past, typically, as I say, the farmer and the permit holder had to find each other and strike some sort of unique deal. It made for only a handful of trades. So our theory is a little different. Go 2 slides. Go to another one. Our theory is to put in the middle between the buyer and seller what's called an environmental services clearinghouse. And that's what this legislation that we're working on is all about. But here in Wisconsin, I'll go back, the clearinghouse is building on a strong foundation of trading moves already, trading programs. You already have what's called adaptive management, water quality trading, and then another program which is sort of a compliance delay, or you're buying time through this multi-discharger variance. So these things already exist in Wisconsin, which is very hopeful. You as a state have been forward-looking, but there have not been a lot of transactions around this because, like I say, it's hard to find for the buyers and sellers to find each other. It's hard to track the transaction. And what happens if somebody goes out of business, or the permit changes, or the farm closes? All sorts of things are left in limbo. So there's not been a lot of transactions. All right, go ahead. So it's this clearinghouse that sits in the middle that will do a bunch of things. The most important of which is you as farmers, if you generate the phosphorus reduction on your farm, those credits can be held in the clearinghouse. And if somebody wants to buy those credits, they can buy them out of the clearinghouse. They don't have to come and find you, and you don't have to negotiate your own contract or special deal with the downstream wastewater treatment plant. It also allows you to change your plans. If you create credits for only 2 or 3 years, and then you change how you operate your farm and aren't creating credits, it allows other credits to come in and fulfill that obligation to the wastewater treatment plant or whoever the buyer is. So it provides a tremendous amount of flexibility. The ultimate goal here, it's the dairy industry that has driven this effort for us or by us, and ultimately this is to create a new income stream to your farms that's not directly connected to the milk. It'll allow you to manage your fields in a way that you can think about multiple things. Of course, you're going to think about milk first, rations, healthy yield. But as you think more about low runoff, you can think, can I convert these into credits so that I can generate income from the way I manage my fields, or afford new equipment, or process my manure in a different way? So that gives you a little sense of background, who we are, why we're doing this. I'd like to hand this over to Karen Timberlake. And Jamie, you want to?
Yep, real quick, I just wanted to remind everyone on the phone before we turn it over to Karen to continue that we will take questions at the end. If you could type your questions into the chat feature on the screen, and we'll be sure to address those before we end today. Thank you.
Great. So thanks, Steve, and thanks, Jamie. Do you want to go ahead and move to the slide that addresses the legislation? Perfect. There we are. So as Steve and Jamie noted at the beginning, I'm Karen Timberlake, and I am part of the team here at Michael Best that has really had the privilege of working with Newtrient and with the DBA and with so many other great partners since the beginning of the thought process around this exciting idea of the clearinghouse and making an ecosystem services marketplace really work here in Wisconsin. I think you can tell from Steve's careful explanation of all the thought and the consideration that has gone into this idea that Newtrient is really committed to building something that will work here in Wisconsin for all of the interested parties in our state and for our overall environment as well, and really committed to doing this right and building something that will last. So a few of us are maybe excited about the possibility of seeing a piece of legislation pass. Others of you may be wondering why we had to go to all the trouble. It's obviously much easier not to pass a bill than it is to pass a bill. So what we thought we would do is just take a minute to explain the thought process around why is a piece of legislation needed in order to accomplish all the objectives that Steve just walked through. How did we go about figuring out what the bill should say, and where are we now in the process, and how you and others can continue to be helpful. And again, I would echo Steve's thanks to the Dairy Business Association for its great support of this effort all the way along. So as Steve noted, Newtrient really came to Wisconsin looking for an opportunity to think about how to build out the ecosystem services marketplace. And we began at the very beginning in terms of testing out the ideas with stakeholders who were knowledgeable about our current water quality programs and their strengths as well as their limitations. And we also got some feedback from both the potential credit generator side of the equation as well as the credit purchaser side of the equation. And when it came right down to it, it was through some conversations with our state Department of Natural Resources in particular, where we really crystallized our thinking around, yes, something like a clearinghouse that could sit in the middle between the credit generators and the credit purchasers would be valuable and would help really build out the marketplace in the ways that Steve has described. And in addition to that, yes, we do need a piece of legislation that will create the authority for the state to operate a clearinghouse, and for that clearinghouse in turn to have the authority to purchase environmental services from credit generators like folks on the phone, as well as to sell verified and certified credits to permit holders who need to be able to count on those credits as a condition of their permit. So once we decided that a clearinghouse was the right idea and that legislation would be needed to establish the clearinghouse, then we had to decide what we thought the clearinghouse should do, what its core functions should be, and how the clearinghouse would work with those existing water quality compliance programs that Steve highlighted. So in a nutshell, and all of you who are interested are obviously welcome to go find Senate Bill 91 and read it. We'd be happy to send a link around with the follow-up to this webinar. But the basic structure of the bill, as is highlighted here on the slide, is that it sets up those capabilities the clearinghouse must have and the functions it must perform. And I'll get into the functions a little bit more in just a second. So first and foremost, the bill gives the State Department of Administration the responsibility of holding the contract with the clearinghouse. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One, it really was the guidance of the Department of Natural Resources that the clearinghouse should be an independent entity. There was great value in separating that market maker and outreach function that the clearinghouse would perform from the Clean Water Act and Wisconsin statutory regulatory obligations that the Department of Natural Resources has. In other words, there should be some independence to the work of the clearinghouse while at the same time keeping it tied to that underlying legal and regulatory framework that surrounds water quality in this state and in every state. In addition to that, we wanted to make sure, as I alluded to a second ago, that from the credit purchaser side of the equation, credit purchasers needed to be certain that a credit that they would buy from the clearinghouse was valid, was certified, and would count toward whatever their permit obligation would be. So the bill clearly establishes that although the Department of Administration will hold the contract with the clearinghouse and will ensure that the clearinghouse is capable of doing everything that the bill requires it to do, the Department of Natural Resources retains that oversight responsibility over how many credits certain services and technologies will generate and how those credits will be applied as against permits. So in terms of the core functions of the clearinghouse, they really are at a high level to purchase those ecosystem services, again, the folks who are going to be adopting practices, technologies, other strategies to generate that kind of environmental benefit. So purchase those services, maintain that bank of credits. So as Steve alluded to, the services are provided, the credits are purchased and then held by the clearinghouse for sale to credit purchasers who need them to be applied as against their permits. The clearinghouse also has to hold a reserve pool of credits so that everyone's protected in the case of any kind of failure or non-performance. The clearinghouse has to work directly with the Department of Natural Resources to establish, as noted, the amount of credits that certain approaches will generate, and also the Department of Natural Resources retains the authority to define the geographic scope within which a credit can be generated and sold. And it's worth noting here that on the list of things that people pointed to as far as causes of relatively few water quality trades having been executed, part of the thinking is that there really is a broader geographic scope that still will have validity in terms of the science of where can pollution be avoided upstream and where can that benefit be experienced downstream. But by the same token, the bill directs the Department of Natural Resources to apply its thinking to the largest possible area within which a credit can be generated and purchased while still achieving necessary water quality standards and being in compliance clearly with the Clean Water Act. So those are some of the highlights of the legislation in terms of what it would do, who's in charge, who gets what set of responsibilities. in terms of just quickly where we are kind of in the process, we have been very fortunate to have excellent legislative champions, really starting with Senator Rob Coles, and Senator Jerry Prochaska, who have been with us right from the very beginning, as has Senator Mark Miller on the Democratic side. We've been very careful to cultivate bipartisan legislative sponsors from the very beginning of this work. We're now happy to have 15 of 33 state senators who have signed on as co-sponsors, and I believe about over a third of the state assembly, about 35 of the 99 state assembly representatives who are also co-sponsors. The bill had a public hearing in the sort of latter part of March that both Steve and the Dairy Business Association testified at. The bill passed out of committee unanimously, 5-0, at the end of March, and it now awaits scheduling for a floor vote in the state Senate, which we believe will happen sometime in the middle of May. Jamie, do you want to go to the next slide? So just to think about how to continue to position the support for this legislation, we're really very proud of not only the bipartisan legislative support that we've cultivated, but the support of these very expert and influential and directly interested organizations all around the broader environmental services marketplace concept. So certainly to have the support of the dairy industry is critical. It's equally critical to have the support of environmental groups like Clean Wisconsin and the Nature Conservancy. It's essential to have support of the business community, of municipal wastewater treatment facilities, and all of those groups and more have been part of our outreach and engagement strategy. They've helped shape our thinking, and they have joined us in supporting the legislation and continue to be there with us in helping to make it better. That strategy seemed like the right idea when we began it. It is particularly the right idea as we continue now in Wisconsin with more politically divided state government than we had when we began this work. So we now have a Democratic governor, Tony Evers, who has declared 2019 the year of water, and we have our Republican Assembly Speaker, Robin Vos, who has appointed a Speaker's Task Force on Water Quality. And from our perspective, that's great. That demonstrates the commitment of leadership at the highest levels of our government to continuing to improve water quality. We think that this bill and this concept fit right into both of those agendas, and we're working hard to continue to demonstrate that connection to those leaders and to the other legislators whose support we will need. So to wrap up my portion real quickly, I mentioned that we're right now targeting a vote on this legislation in the state Senate for the middle of May. From there, it will go over to our state assembly, which will hold another public hearing, and then be scheduled, assuming a favorable vote in the assembly committee, will be scheduled for a vote in the state assembly at some point, yes, this year, and signed by the governor at that time. So, again, we've been very appreciative of the DBA's support and assistance with the legislative process. We also would welcome the support of people like you listening on the webinar in making some direct outreach to your own legislators, state senators, and state representatives. There is nothing more persuasive to a policymaker than to hear from one of their own constituents on a particular issue, why that issue is important to the constituent, how it affects them, and why the legislator should view a particular idea one way or the other. So we'll be working with the DBA and with Newtrient following this webinar to get some suggested talking points out to you, and I'll just thank you in advance for any outreach you're able to make in support of this legislation. So with that, Jamie and Steve, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Karen. So just to close out, wanted to touch on, you heard how we're committed in Wisconsin and excited about the work that's happening, but you may be asking, why now? We see this as a huge window of opportunity because we're also seeing support from the national level. So you can see with these two announcements in December, EPA as well as USDA came out with a joint statement encouraging states and stakeholders to find creative and collaborative solutions to water quality, and even pointed to market-based solutions. So we're seeing that support from the national level, and although we're not necessarily waiting around for support to come from the national level, we think now is the prime time to pursue these types of approaches, and we're excited about the work moving forward. So I just wanted to close out on a few things, and Karen hit on some of these nicely. You're sitting here, what can your role be? What are next steps, and how can we continue to move this forward through DBA and you, and as well as Michael Best? So first and foremost, appreciate all the work that you do as dairy farmers to adopt new sustainable practices. And so I would say, continue just employing the technologies and practices that you can on your farm to improve the environment. Secondly, demonstrating support for the Senate Bill 91. We will pull together some resources to kind of help assist you in this, but I think over the next few months, having a farmer voice in this conversation goes a long way. So the most you can do is, reach out to your legislators and your state representatives, and we will help you do that. The third is contact Newtrient if you'd like to learn more. If you would like information on the Senate Bill 91, we can certainly share that. If you'd like more details on how this approach might work in your state or for your farm, we're happy to talk to you, and I've left Newtrient's contact information there. And then just to stay connected, we have a newsletter that you can sign up for on the Newtrient site at newtrient.com. On the homepage, you can enter your email and sign up, and we will provide updates as news unravels over the next few months around the work in Wisconsin. So I think we actually have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll go ahead and read those. The first question is for Steve. What is your view on carbon credit aggregation and the potential for using that as a revenue stream and the method for reducing greenhouse gases? Are you looking at this, or have you in the past?
Well, I love the question. I wish I could take credit for having planted that in the audience. We actually right now have been working with another group called Ecosystem Services Market Consortium that is looking at how to develop carbon credits for what we can do on our farms. Typically, the only carbon credits that are available now to us are very limited, us meaning dairy farmers, very limited. And a couple of the reasons are, one, the traditional carbon credit that can be sold today, they talk about it having to be permanent. Well, nothing on our land is permanent. We can do things, say, with a 20-year horizon, but being permanent is very difficult. We also, they require additionality, meaning things that have to, if you can do them today and you do them, but you've been doing them all along, you're not creating new credits. These are just a couple of examples of why agriculture has not really had an easy access to creating carbon credits in the general carbon marketplace, which is really only California. Having said all that, we are working very hard to change some of those rules around carbon credits, and you're going to see some announcements in the coming weeks around this Ecosystem Services Marketplace Consortium. Newtrient is on their steering committee, and we have been since its beginning. I think that there is a significant group of consumer product companies that have come together and are ready to start to buy these credits from us in the agricultural space. So it's absolutely correct. It's the right question. Newtrient has put themselves in the middle of this conversation, and I'm wholeheartedly supportive of it. There's a lot that agriculture can do, and so far the system has not allowed us to really show off what we could do, and so I'm all for it, 100%. So.
Great. A couple more questions. The second is, do you foresee any government-sponsored financing programs for dairy farmers to implement a manure management or a phosphorus mitigation program?
So if I'm understanding this has to do is, are there federal funds available? So you're going to hear us talking more about a large-scale project that Newtrient's going to be in the middle of that really shows off what we as farmers can do in this arena. And that's going to entail a big policy effort. I actually believe that we should start selling our services rather than getting paid to do certain practices. So in other words, today you can get paid to do some monies out of NRCS and USDA for things like conservation practices. I would actually like to see that shift to they'll pay for results. If those results are keeping phosphorus out of the river, let's get paid to deliver those goods. If that means lowering the temperature on trout streams, let's get paid for planting brush and trees along the shoreline. Those are the kinds of things I'd like the shift to go. Will the federal government put up more money than they are today? In total, I would like it to be the case, but it's going to be difficult. But there are some programs that are currently not available to us that should be. There are some huge investment tax credit programs available. For example, the oil and gas industry can recover a tremendous amount of tax advantage if they capture carbon. All right? So why shouldn't those same dollars be available to the agricultural community when we know we can capture carbon in our soil? So those are the kinds of little shifts, taking existing programs and making sure they apply to agriculture as well. So that's a big part of our focus.
All right, and the last question before we finish up. The state approving a bill is the first step. How long do you foresee that rulemaking process will take with DNR and EPA following this first step of?
There's somebody who understands their state. Okay. One of the things we didn't highlight earlier is part of the reason we went through a legislative process is because, as this writer knows, the administrative process is so long and so difficult. So we have tried, and Karen, jump in if I misstate any of this, but we have really tried to minimize the need for administrative rulemaking, which in your state is very often about 3 years. So we're hoping, if I remember the timeline correctly, Karen, if the bill passes its final stages in the fall, we'll start to implement a clearinghouse and a contract with the Department of Administration. And so I would say 18 months to 2 years, when I would really like to see the clearinghouse helping to facilitate more and more trades. I don't think there's going to be a need for additional rulemaking to implement this statute. Karen, have I misguided anything here?
I don't think so. A couple of quick thoughts to add. One would be, obviously, none of us can control when the bill will finally pass and be signed, and so that crossing of the starting line is a little bit uncertain at this point. With that said, I would underscore Steve's point that we've done what we can to streamline the startup elements of the whole clearinghouse and to make it very clear who should do what and what the clearinghouse itself is expected to be able to accomplish. It's also been clear to us, and Steve, I think you would agree with this, from our outreach with the legislators, with current agency leadership, with the governor's office, that there's a high sense of urgency here. Everyone understands that there are opportunities being left on the table right now. Everyone understands the pressures facing the dairy industry in the state as well as other agricultural producers. Everyone understands that water quality needs to continue to be improved. And so I think where it's possible for us to be efficient and quick in the work that we do to set this up while still making sure that it works for everybody, I think all of the interests are aligned to make that so.
Good questions. Very good questions. I know these were quick answers. Everybody, really, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We love the conversation, and the more we know about even individual farms, I know a bunch of folks up there, either directly or through folks we work with. But don't hesitate to call Newtrient. We're happy to field calls and answer questions. So same thing with DBA as well. And I do want to give a special thanks and a shout out to Michael Best. They've been a tremendous partner. Their knowledge of the legislative process here and the members has been great. And I know they work closely with DBA, and I just want to commend that. I think it's a great choice and a great partnership. So really happy to be a part of it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Steve, Karen, and Jamie, for your time and expertise. That concludes our webinar. If you're interested in the recording, please email Joanna Guza. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.